The press briefing room at the White House buzzed with the low hum of conversation, camera shutters clicking, and the metallic clatter of laptops. It was supposed to be another routine afternoon, questions about polling numbers, the economy, and policy updates. But beneath that familiar rhythm was an undercurrent of unease. For weeks, the situation in Gaza had dominated global headlines, and public outrage had reached a fever pitch. Everyone in that room knew someone was going to bring it up, everyone, except perhaps Karine Jean-Pierre herself. She entered the room with her usual measured confidence, dressed immaculately, binder in hand, smile polite but distant. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, scanning the sea of reporters. "Let's start with today's announcements." Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, like a performer who sensed the audience was waiting for something unexpected. For the first 10 minutes, the briefing unfolded predictably. Questions about infrastructure funding, campaign strategy, and the president's upcoming trip filled the air. Karine handled each with the precision of a seasoned spokesperson, deflecting gracefully, redirecting when needed, keeping the tone neutral and the message controlled. Then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the chatter. "Karine," said Layla Haddad, a journalist from Global Now, her voice steady but sharp enough to slice through the tension. "When will the administration take responsibility for its silence on the ongoing atrocities in Gaza?" The room went still, heads turned, the faint hum of air conditioning filled the pause. Jean-Pierre froze for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough for the cameras to catch. "Thank you for your question, Layla," she said after a moment, adjusting her binder. "As we've said before, the United States remains deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in the region. We continue to engage with our allies and partners to de-escalate the violence and support humanitarian aid efforts." It was the kind of answer that had worked 100 times before. "But not today." Respectfully, Layla pressed, "Concern doesn't save lives. Children are dying every day under bombardment. Hospitals are being destroyed. You speak of de-escalation, yet the U.S. continues to supply weapons to the very government accused of committing these acts. How does that align with the administration's stated commitment to human rights?" A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters exchanged glances. Cameras zoomed in. Jean-Pierre's posture stiffened. She tried to maintain composure, but the edge in her voice was undeniable. "Layla, I think it's important to recognize that the U.S. has always supported Israel's right to defend itself while also advocating for the protection of civilians. We're working closely with partners to ensure aid reaches those in need." "But Karine," Layla interrupted, her voice rising just slightly, "how do you defend sending weapons to a government accused by the UN of war crimes? You can't call for peace with one hand while funding destruction with the other. Isn't that hypocrisy?" The question hit like a thunderclap. A few gasps echoed from the back of the room. Jean-Pierre blinked, visibly thrown. Her usual arsenal of calm phrases, "I won't get ahead of the president, we're closely monitoring the situation," suddenly felt inadequate. "I reject that characterization," she replied, her tone sharper now. "The United States is committed to peace and stability in the region. We mourn every innocent life lost, and we are actively engaging with both sides too." Layla didn't let her finish. "Engaging, or avoiding accountability. The people in Gaza don't have time for statements. Karine, they need action. Isn't silence, at this point, complicity?" That last word, complicity, hung in the air like smoke. The press corps shifted, sensing history unfolding. Jean-Pierre's jaw tightened. For the first time, her voice faltered. "Again," she said, forcing steadiness, "we reject that assertion. The president has made clear." But no one was listening to the script anymore. The reporters had found their courage. Another journalist jumped in. "Karine, will the U.S. reconsider its military aid in light of the civilian casualties?" Then another. "Has the administration discussed any accountability measures for alleged violations of international law?" The briefing room transformed. What began as a routine session became an impromptu tribunal. Jean-Pierre's control over the narrative unraveled as the questions came faster, louder, and more pointed. Outside, social media erupted. Clips of the exchange spread across platforms within minutes. Hashtags like #ConfrontKJP, #GazaQuestions, and #PressFreedom trended globally. Commentators hailed Layla as the first journalist to truly challenge the administration's narrative. Back inside, Jean-Pierre's hands gripped the edges of her binder tightly. Her carefully composed tone began to show strain. "We're out of time," she said finally, cutting off another question mid-sentence. "Thank you, everyone." She closed her notes, gave a curt nod, and exited swiftly, without her usual closing smile. The silence that followed was deafening. Reporters exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and admiration. It was clear to everyone in that room, something had shifted. The briefing had cracked open a conversation that could no longer be contained. And as cameras powered down and the buzz of conversation returned, Layla sat quietly in her seat, heart pounding, knowing she had just set in motion a storm that even the White House couldn't control. The morning after the confrontation, Washington woke up to a different kind of storm. Every major network led with the same footage: Layla Haddad standing her ground in the White House press room, her voice cutting through layers of political language like a blade. The image of Karine Jean-Pierre's frozen expression had already become a meme, a symbol, and a headline all at once. Cable news anchors called it the moment the message cracked. Online, millions of viewers replayed the clip, dissecting every word, every flicker of emotion. Hashtags like #ConfrontKJP, #Gaza Press Briefing, and #Truth to Power dominated the digital space. Even typically neutral outlets were running op-eds with titles like "Silence is not diplomacy" and "A turning point at the White House." Inside the administration, the reaction was swift and panicked. The communications team held an emergency meeting at dawn. Some advisors were furious, accusing the press corps of orchestrating an ambush. Others warned that ignoring the fallout would only make things worse. By mid-morning, an official statement was released. The United States continues to work tirelessly with partners in the region to protect civilians, expand humanitarian access, and pursue a sustainable peace. But the statement fell flat. It was too polished, too sanitized. It didn't address the real issue: why the administration was avoiding the word everyone else was using: crimes. Meanwhile, Layla Haddad had become a sensation. Her small newsroom, Global Now, was overwhelmed. Their website crashed twice from record-breaking traffic. Donations poured in. Invitations for interviews flooded her inbox. For the first time in her career, Layla was the story. But she wasn't basking in it. In fact, she was uneasy. "This shouldn't be about me," she told a colleague quietly as they reviewed the footage. "It should be about the people in Gaza. That's the point." Still, she knew the moment had power. That night, she appeared on a primetime broadcast with a major news network. The host introduced her as the journalist who dared to ask what no one else would. Layla didn't flinch. "I didn't dare," she said calmly. "I did my job. The world deserves straight answers when innocent lives are being lost." Her words resonated. By morning, protests had erupted outside the White House gates. Thousands gathered, waving banners that read, "Answer for Gaza, no more excuses," and "Humanity first." Candlelight vigils appeared in cities across the U.S., Washington, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, all organized overnight through social media. Inside the press office, the atmosphere was tense. Karine Jean-Pierre avoided interviews that week, canceling several public appearances. Staffers said she was shaken, not just by the confrontation itself, but by how it refused to fade away. Every briefing after that felt different. Reporters came armed with harder questions, unwilling to accept vague reassurances. The White House press corps, long accused of being too cautious, had found its backbone. A week later, Jean-Pierre stepped back to the podium, this time with noticeably less confidence. The room was quieter, heavier, as if everyone sensed the weight of the moment. She began with a statement that surprised many. "Yesterday's questions reflected the pain and frustration that so many are feeling," she said slowly. "We recognize that the situation in Gaza has caused unimaginable suffering. The president is reviewing all options to ensure humanitarian aid reaches civilians without delay." It wasn't an apology, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that the shield of political language had cracked. Outside the U.S., the ripple effects were enormous. Leaders from allied countries began facing similar questions from their own press. European journalists cited Layla's confrontation during their briefings. "When will our government show the courage to ask the same?" one commentator wrote. Back in Washington, Layla became both a symbol and a target. Supporters hailed her courage, calling her the conscience of journalism. Critics accused her of grandstanding. Anonymous trolls flooded her social media. But she stayed firm, refusing to be silenced. "If the truth makes people uncomfortable," she said during another interview, "then maybe it's about time we all felt uncomfortable." Behind closed doors, officials debated how to manage the narrative. Some urged the administration to issue a stronger humanitarian stance to calm the public uproar. Others feared appearing to bow under media pressure. But the damage, or perhaps the awakening, had already been done. Weeks later, a quiet but significant shift occurred. The U.S. announced a temporary suspension of certain arms shipments pending human rights assessments. Aid convoys began entering Gaza with U.S. logistical support. It wasn't a full reversal of policy, but it was a start. For the first time in months, humanitarian organizations saw a glimmer of hope. When asked by a reporter if she believed her confrontation had sparked that change, Layla hesitated. "I think truth has power," she said softly. "But it only works if people listen." Maybe, finally, they're listening. The clip of her question and Jean-Pierre's reaction continued to circulate long after the protests ended. It was studied in journalism schools, analyzed in political science classes, and remembered by millions as the day the walls of controlled speech began to crack. And though Karine Jean-Pierre eventually regained her footing, she never quite faced another press room the same way. Every time she stepped to that podium, the echo of Layla's voice seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that power, no matter how polished, can still be challenged by one simple, dangerous thing: the truth.